For over 1,000 years, Vietnamese emperors ruled from ornate thrones, commanding vast armies and holding a mandate they believed came from heaven itself. The Nguyen dynasty, the last imperial house of Vietnam, presided over a unified kingdom stretching from the Chinese border to the tip of the Mekong Delta. 13 emperors sat on the dragon throne. They built the forbidden Purple City in Hue, a walled imperial complex so sacred that ordinary Vietnamese could be executed simply for entering without permission. They held the title, Son of Heaven, placing them above every living soul in the kingdom. And then, within a single generation, it was all gone. Not just the empire, the family itself was swept aside by revolution, occupation, and war. The last emperor signed away his throne with a brush stroke. His empress fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and jewelry hidden in her luggage. Imperial princes died in labor camps. Princesses scrubbed floors in foreign cities. Children of the Dragon Throne grew up stateless and penniless in countries that had no idea what they had lost. This is one of the most overlooked royal tragedies in modern history. The details are far more devastating and far more human than almost anyone knows. Let me take you through the full story of what happened to Vietnam's imperial family after their empire collapsed, because the details are shocking. To understand the fall, you first need to understand what was lost. The Nguyen dynasty came to power in 1802 when Nguyen An, after decades of civil war, finally unified Vietnam. He took the name Gia Long and established his capital at Hue. Hue became the cultural heart of the empire, home to the imperial citadel and royal tombs that stretched across the hills like a permanent testament to dynastic ambition. The Nguyen emperors modeled their court on Chinese tradition. The emperor was the intermediary between the divine and the human world. At its height, the dynasty governed 30 million people across territory encompassing modern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was a sophisticated civilization with architecture of genuine beauty and power. If you want to keep following stories like this, histories that textbooks skip over, hit that subscribe button right now. There are more stories waiting for you, and you won't want to miss them. The empire Gia Long built began dying almost as soon as it was born. The French arrived in the mid-1800s, and by 1887, the entire country was part of French Indochina. The Nguyen emperors didn't disappear, but they were transformed into ceremonial figureheads. The emperor could not make war, conduct foreign policy, or even dismiss his own ministers without French approval. When individual emperors proved too independent, the French simply replaced them. Emperor Ham Nghi was exiled to Algeria for 60 years. Emperor Tan Tai was declared mentally ill and exiled to the island of Reunion. His son, Emperor Duay Tan, was caught planning an uprising at 17 and also exiled. By the 20th century, the imperial family had learned a devastating lesson: the Dragon Throne existed only at the pleasure of France. Into this compromised institution stepped Bao Dai, the only son of Emperor Khai Din. Educated in France from age 9, he grew up in Paris absorbing Western culture. He loved tennis, hunting, and nightclubs. He became emperor at 12, though he didn't assume power until 1932. From the beginning, his reign was a contradiction. He spoke of modernization, but the French knew he lacked the power to threaten them. Then came World War II. In 1940, Japan moved into Indochina. For a brief moment in 1945, Bao Dai was emperor of a nominally independent Vietnam under Japanese patronage. It lasted exactly 5 months. When Japan surrendered, a force moved with stunning speed: Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. On August 25, 1945, at the noon gate of the Imperial Citadel, Bao Dai handed over the Imperial Seal and the Imperial Sword to representatives of the Viet Minh government. He read a statement that contained a line that still echoes through Vietnamese history: "I prefer to be a free citizen of an independent country rather than the emperor of an enslaved nation." With that, 13 generations of Nguyen imperial rule came to an end. And what came next for the family was a story of loss, exile, and quiet tragedy that the world almost entirely forgot. If Bao Dai's story is one of compromised power and eventual irrelevance, the story of his wife, Empress Nam Phuong, is one of the purest personal tragedies of the entire collapse. Nam Phuong was born in 1914 into a wealthy Catholic Vietnamese family from the south. She was educated in France, spoke French more fluently than Vietnamese, and was by all accounts a woman of genuine grace and intelligence. When she married Bao Dai in 1934, she became the first woman in Vietnamese history to hold the title of Empress Consort. Previous emperors' wives had been elevated only posthumously. She bore Bao Dai 5 children. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a dignified and deeply private person who took her role seriously even as the institution she represented crumbled around her. After the abdication, the family's situation deteriorated rapidly. The Viet Minh allowed Bao Dai to remain in Vietnam briefly as a supreme advisor, a meaningless title designed to give the new government a thin veneer of historical legitimacy. But by 1946, it was clear that this arrangement was dangerous. Bao Dai eventually went to Hong Kong, then to China. The French, still trying to reassemble their colonial authority in Vietnam, convinced him to return as the head of a nominally independent Vietnamese state within the French Union. It was essentially the same humiliating arrangement his ancestors had endured, repackaged with different branding. He accepted, which permanently damaged his credibility with Vietnamese nationalists of every political stripe. Nam Phuong refused to follow her husband into this compromise. She took their children to France, settling in a modest chateau in the Salogne region. And there, in the quiet French countryside, the last Empress of Vietnam spent the rest of her life. She rarely spoke of Vietnam in public. She raised her children. She attended church. She lived simply, far removed from the dynastic grandeur that had defined her marriage. There were no palaces, no court rituals, no ladies-in-waiting. There was a modest French chateau and a woman who carried her grief with absolute composure. On September 14, 1963, Nam Phuong died alone in her chateau in France. She was 49 years old. No Vietnamese official attended her funeral. No ceremony marked her passing. The last Empress of Vietnam was buried in a French village, far from the Perfume River and the forbidden Purple City where she had once held court. She deserved better. History gave her almost nothing. Bao Dai's story continued, but it is not a story of dignity maintained. After the French-supported state of Vietnam collapsed following the catastrophic French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Bao Dai was left without a role, without a country, and without a purpose. No Dinh Diem, backed by the United States, organized a referendum in 1955 that removed Bao Dai as head of state and established the Republic of Vietnam. The referendum was almost certainly fraudulent. Diem reportedly received 98% of the vote in some regions. But the result was final. Bao Dai was now simply a private citizen with a famous surname and an increasingly irrelevant past. He settled in France and lived there for the rest of his life. He had multiple relationships, eventually marrying a French woman named Monique Baudat in 1982, decades after Nam Phuong's death. He wrote his memoirs. He gave occasional interviews. He was treated as a curiosity, a relic of a world that had been destroyed twice over, first by revolution and then by decades of devastating war that killed millions. The Vietnam War, the conflict that consumed his former country from the mid-1950s through 1975, raged entirely without him. He watched from Paris while the country his family had ruled for nearly a century and a half was torn apart by ideology, superpower rivalry, and extraordinary human suffering. He had no influence over any of it. He was a footnote while history thundered past. Bao Dai died in Paris on July 31, 1997. He was 83 years old. He was buried in the Passy Cemetery in Paris. The Dragon Throne had been empty for over 50 years. The 5 children of Bao Dai and Nam Phuong lived lives that illustrated perfectly the particular tragedy of being royal in a world that had moved violently past monarchy. Crown Prince Bao Long, the eldest son and heir who would have become emperor of a country that no longer had an emperor, served in the French Foreign Legion. He later worked quietly in banking. He died in 2007 in France, having spent virtually his entire adult life as a private citizen in a country that was not the one his family had built. The daughters found their own paths in French society, education, marriage, and quiet lives far from the imperial world their mother had briefly inhabited. None of them returned to live in Vietnam. The country they might have called home was, for most of their adult lives, either at war or governed by a communist party that had no interest in rehabilitating the memory of the imperial family. The Nguyen descendants are scattered today across France, the United States, Canada, and Australia. They carry a surname that connects them to one of Southeast Asia's most significant dynasties. Most live entirely ordinary lives. Some work to preserve the history and culture of the Nguyen period. A few have returned to Vietnam as tourists, walking through the Imperial Citadel in Hue, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as visitors to the legacy of their own ancestors. Imagine standing in the forbidden Purple City knowing that your grandmother walked those same corridors as Empress, and that your family was erased from that story not by death but by history itself. The fall of Vietnam's imperial family was not just a dynastic tragedy. It was part of a massive transformation that reshaped an entire region and sent ripples outward that the world is still feeling. The collapse of the Nguyen dynasty created the political vacuum that the French exploited, that the Japanese briefly filled, and that ultimately unleashed the ideological struggle between Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary nationalism and Western-backed anti-communism. The Vietnam War that followed killed between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese and more than 50,000 Americans. It was in many ways the direct consequence of that original imperial collapse and the failure to replace it with anything stable. The abolition of the monarchy also erased something cultural and spiritual that Vietnam has never fully replaced. The Nguyen dynasty was not just a government. It was the custodian of Vietnamese literary tradition, architectural heritage, ceremonial ritual, and national identity in a form that had existed for over a millennium. When that was dismantled, something irreplaceable went with it. Today, Vietnam is experiencing something like a cultural revival of interest in the Nguyen period. The imperial citadel at Hue draws millions of tourists annually. Traditional Nguyen court music has been recognized by UNESCO. Vietnamese scholars are producing serious academic work on the imperial period that would have been politically dangerous just decades ago. The communist government that displaced the dynasty now quietly promotes its heritage as a tourist attraction. History is strange that way. There is something uniquely heartbreaking about the story of Vietnam's imperial family that sets it apart even from other great dynastic collapses. The Romanovs were murdered. Their tragedy was immediate, violent, and total. The Ottomans were exiled en masse, their fall dramatic enough to generate its own mythology. But the Nguyen dynasty simply faded. Quietly. Incrementally. In French chateaux and Paris apartments and Foreign Legion postings, with no single moment dramatic enough to force the world to pay attention. Nam Phuong died alone at 49 in a French village. Bao Dai spent 40 years as an increasingly irrelevant exile. Their children grew up French in everything but blood. The palaces where their family had ruled for a century and a half became museums, then tourist attractions, then UNESCO heritage sites, magnificent stone testaments to a dynasty that history had concluded it no longer needed. The House of Nguyen still exists in its scattered descendants. It carries no political ambitions and wields no power. It preserves its history through memoirs, family gatherings, and the quiet dignity of people who understand that they are the living connection to something vast and gone. Because when power is taken away gradually, not in a single dramatic blow but in a long slow erosion, the tragedy is harder to see and harder to mourn. But it is no less real. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Should Vietnam have kept a constitutional monarchy the way some Asian nations did? Could the Nguyen dynasty have survived with a different last emperor? I want to hear your thoughts. I will see you in the next one.